All right. Welcome to the Badass Lifter podcast. That feels good to say. I'm pretty excited about this. Now, for those of you who have already been regular podcast listeners, you know this as the Who's Lifting Today podcast, but we're making some changes. We're changing the focus a little bit. We're going to move on to the Badass Lifter podcast. And this episode is going to be about, why are we making this change, for starters, as well. And what can you expect in the future? Like, what are episodes going to be about? And for those of you who came from the Who's Lifting Today podcast, you get to use this episode to know what to expect in the future. And if you're a new listener, and this is a good way to figure out what to expect as a new listener to the podcast. I spend a lot of time thinking about what is the best thing that I can do, that I can put out there to truly help people in their strength training journey. I do think this is the podcast. I do think that the podcast gives the best information that it can and allows people to really realize how strong they can become. And we're going to kind of talk about what's the same, what's different from before, and kind of talk about what this podcast will be focused on in the future and what's changing. So I think what I want for this podcast, and this is a big problem I see in the fitness industry right now, is we help intermediate lifters a lot, like people who are already well into training, who are comfortable with training, they've got the basics down. We don't help the beginners as much as I would like. And that's what I want this podcast to be focused on, is how do we help new lifters, beginner lifters, people who are not well into their lifting journey yet, but want to be. They want to thrive in strength training, or maybe they're coming back into strength training and they're nervous about getting back into it. I want to help beginners. I want to help people really strive in their strength training journey. If you're new to lifting or you're a beginner lifter, that's what this podcast is going to be about. And I want to give you all the tools to stick with strength training, to thrive in strength training. And I want there to be, whatever issue you have in strength training, I want there to be a podcast episode that resolves that issue. Whether it's, I don't have time, I'm nervous about training, what exercises should I be doing? What is the best workout for me as a beginner? That's what this podcast is going to be about. How do we really help those people? Because I think the problem that happens right now is there's a lot of fitness information online, but not a lot of it is truly for beginners in strength training. And we teach a lot of intermediate level stuff, but we can't, that stuff is, while it will become useful, it's not useful yet. And sometimes I see beginners will focus on things that honestly don't matter yet in their strength training journey. There's other things that matter more than, stuff you might see online, whether we're talking about perfect nutrient timing or periodization or, what is the most optimal exercise. A lot of those they're interesting conversations, but they're not really what beginners need to focus on. Beginners need to focus on what's the best routine for you? What is the goal that you should be focusing on as a beginner? What are the key movements that I need to learn how to master before I start doing more advanced stuff? Those are going to be the things that matter the most to you at the beginning. And then once you're done being a beginner, you can definitely, major in the minors like that and focus on extra stuff like supplementation or whatever it might be. By supplements, I mean creatine, protein powder, not steroids, tren, that kind of. This is not that kind of podcast, okay? We're not going to promote that kind of stuff. But we need to focus at the beginning. And so this podcast is going to be what do you need to work with? What do you need to start doing before you can get into that stuff? And how do you stick with it? That's also going to be something we talk about as well, because that's also a very big challenge that exists, where a lot of people will start strength training. They'll give it a shot at some point, and then for a number of reasons, they don't stick with it. And there's absolutely no judgment here on that, but we need to talk about why and how to overcome that, because the real benefit of strength training comes long term. You'll definitely see results in the beginning, and if you have the right program for you and the right exercises, but you need to focus on how do we stick with it long term? Because that's where you're going to see the most benefit. So helping new beginner lifters, which I think is really missed in the fitness world and is not done very well, that's what this podcast is going to be about. I also want to help people who don't fit the regular fitness mold. So I think the fitness world is very welcoming to a select group of people, but it is not that welcoming to a large, I almost want to say even like majority of people. Like if you are young and fit and naturally athletic, I think the fitness world welcomes you with open arms. I think if you don't fit that category, it doesn't really. And it doesn't really talk about you, and it doesn't really focus on you. And that's a shame, because strength training is for everybody. Everyone can focus on strength training. It is not for a certain age or a certain look or lifestyle or whatever it might be. Like, we can all benefit from learning to lift weights, learning to become stronger. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge. And I want this podcast to be able to like help people who don't fit the normal mold. Like if you're in your 40s and you have kids and you have other responsibilities and you're, matching or you're trying to get strength training into like a very busy life. I want this podcast to help you. If your life isn't 100% fitness, I still want you able to benefit from fitness. You don't have to live fitness to get real results and see how strong you can become. And I want this podcast to showcase that and show you that you can be strong, even if you don't fit what you might see as like the fitness mold, let's say, and then going from there. Another thing that I want to focus on here on the podcast, and this is still true as before, but I think for new listeners, this is like important to clarify that like this is not a weight loss podcast. This is not an aesthetics focused podcast. If anything, this podcast focuses on why you shouldn't focus on that. It's known as a weight neutral approach to training, which is, we're going to make you strong, we'll make you healthy, we'll make you fulfilled in your training journey, but we're not here to have weight loss as like the primary goal or to guarantee a certain look. For a lot of reasons, I don't think that's the right way to look at fitness. I think fitness has a lot more to offer than that. I completely understand that those are very common goals, and I completely understand that most of the fitness world talks about training in that way. I want to show you a different side. I want to show you that there is a different way of looking at training that is not just, how much weight can you lose with this exercise? Or will this make me toned? Or will this get me the right body for this time? I want to show you a different side. I want to show you that like strength training doesn't have to be about that. It can be about much more. It can be a lot more fulfilling than what I think those journeys offer. And right, so like that's a big clarification, and that we're going to have episodes talking about like how to look at fitness in a different way that I think is more fulfilling, that works, more long term, and then going from there. So still a weight neutral podcast. People who, if you've been listening already, this is not going to be new. If you are new to listening, then like I'm going to show you kind of like a new approach to training, because I think the weight neutral approach isn't really shown in a lot of the fitness industry. There's not many of us that are truly weight neutral, and I want to show you at least like a different side on like how you can perceive training, or like what training can do for you is not just like how it changes how you look. The last thing that we're going to talk about as well is that there's going to be a new Instagram and TikTok page. So Instagram had a page, the Who's Lifting Today podcast. That has been changed to the @Badass Lifter podcast. So if you've already been following that, you're still there. There's going to be a TikTok one as well, filled with podcast clips, updates on the podcast. If you want to share your thoughts on the podcast, what you want to learn more about, those are the places to reach me at. You can send me an email as well if you want. But if you have thoughts on the podcast, if you want to hear about updates, upcoming episodes, things like that, the Instagram and TikTok page, and I'll put them in the show notes below. Those are going to be things that you can contact me with, find out about more information, and then go from there. I want to thank everyone who has listened in the past. I've had listeners for years now, like tell me they love the episodes, and that's awesome. And I really appreciate that. And the podcast is still going to be making you a strong, badass lifter. That's still the focus. We're just making some changes here because I think this is the way that I can give the most value to the podcast. And so I'm excited for new listeners. I appreciate the old listeners, and I love hearing your comments and what you think about the podcast and which episodes you found were valuable. And for a lot of those older episodes, especially the ones that helped a lot of people, we're going to keep those around. But I'm just excited for this change. I think that this is like the best way that I can help you with your strength training journey. I think this is where I can provide the most value for you. And I would love to know your thoughts and what you're looking forward to. But in the meantime, thanks for listening to the Badass Lifter podcast.